The Navajo. About 3,600 Navajo fought for the United States during World War II. Find the truth. Everything you are about to read is true, except for one sentence on this page. Which one is true? True or false? In the 1930s, the U.S. government killed more than 4/5 of the livestock on Navajo land. True or false? Kachina dolls are sacred objects to the Navajo. Find the answers in this book. This map shows the extent of the Navajo lands at the time of European contact and where the Hopi and Navajo reservations are today. The white is Navajo lands at the time of European contact, and the orange is present-day Navajo reservations. The purple color is present-day Hopi reservations. Where it all began. 1,000 or more years ago, the ancestors of the Navajo people lived near Great Slave Lake in northwestern Canada. They called themselves the Dene, meaning the people. They spoke an Athabascan language related to languages still spoken by native peoples such as the Denisulain and the Slavey, who live in today's Canada and Alaska. By the 1200s, large numbers of Dene had migrated to the American Southwest. Today, more than 170,000 Navajo speak Dene Bizad, the traditional Navajo language. Adopting new ways. In the Southwest, the Dene at first lived as they long had, by gathering wild plants and hunting animals for meat. Throughout Navajo history, the Dene often adopted other people's good ideas. In the 1200s, for example, they began to trade goods with southwestern Pueblo peoples such as the Hopi and the Zuni. While these native groups had been actively trading, the Navajo had focused more on hunting and gathering. A Pueblo woman decorates pottery. The Navajo learned to make pottery from the Pueblo. Not all corn is yellow. The Pueblo raise red and blue corn too. A Pueblo farmer tends a corn plant. Some farming tools had long handles with blades made from animal bones. The Pueblo peoples lived as farmers. They could trade Dine, hunters, new foods, and fabrics in return for bison, buffalo, meat, and hides. Though the desert Southwest offered little water, the Pueblo channeled it with ditches and held it in man-made lakes. That allowed them to grow squash, beans, and the most important crop of all, maize, or corn. They also wove and traded cotton, a plant fiber good for making clothes and other things. The Four Corners region is home to Monument Valley. Over many years, wind and other natural forces shaped the rock formations found in the area. Dinata. The Dine lived in an area they called Dinata, in what is known today as the Four Corners region. This region includes parts of modern-day Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, and Utah. The Navajo story of the world's creation takes place in Dinata. They consider it a holy place. Much of Dinata stands a mile or more above sea level. Flat-top mesas rise over the landscape. The San Juan River runs near a maze of canyons. Though Dinata has no borders, the center of it sits within an area surrounded by Hesperus Peak to the north, Blanca Peak to the east, Mount Taylor to the south, and the San Francisco Peaks to the west. By 1500, the Dene had made the area their own. It was only around 1750 that other groups of people began to push them to move. One group came from across the Atlantic Ocean, the Spanish. The Navajo came for Hesperus Peak, meaning big mountain sheep. The Spanish entered a Pueblo settlement called Hawaka. The age of raiding and trading. The Spanish conquered central Mexico in the 1500s. Over the next century, they worked their way north. Eventually, they built settlements east of Dinata and named the nearby Dene the Navajo. The Spanish also pushed the Pueblo lands and mistreated them. Mine owners made them dig for minerals. Priests prevented them from practicing their religions and ordered them to worship in Catholic churches. Some Spanish soldiers wore heavy metal armor in the hot American Southwest. The Spanish introduced cattle to the Pueblo. Some raiding native groups stole cattle from Pueblo villages. Native groups banded together to push back against the Spaniards. At the time, the Navajo and another Athabascan language people, the Apache, raided the Pueblo peoples who helped the Spanish. The Spanish answered by building forts and sending in soldiers to protect themselves and their allies, the Pueblos. But the Spanish had already brought something that would make the Navajo tougher and harder to catch. Horse people. Before 1492, no horses lived in North or South America. The wild horses that once roamed both continents had died out at the end of the last ice age. But there were still horses in Europe. As Europeans began to settle the Americas, they brought horses along to help in war, farming, and exploration. Native peoples were impressed by the animals. Once Spanish settlers brought horses north, the Navajo lives changed. The Navajo learned to ride horses by the early 1600s. Horses made travel faster and easier for the Navajo. The Pueblo battled the Spanish in 1680. The horse allowed the Navajo and their Apache allies to make quick raids. When drought struck in the 1670s, they ignored the Spanish soldiers and raided Pueblo peoples for food. The Pueblos were angry about the raids and the lack of support from the Spaniards. In 1680, they rose up and drove the Spanish out of New Mexico. But the victory only lasted 12 years. As the Spanish returned, some Pueblo bands migrated into Dineta. Raiding. Raiding by Navajo riders angered the Spanish. They considered it theft. The idea behind raiding, however, was more complicated. The Navajo, like many native peoples, had raided their rivals long before Europeans arrived. Warriors did this not to just acquire goods, but to earn respect for their daring and bravery. Because being captured might mean torture and death, a warrior considered raided goods a fair and legal reward for taking risks. The Navajo captured 20,000 mules and horses and 800,000 sheep and cattle in raids over a period of 4 years in the 1800s. On guard. During this troubled time, the Navajo built towers of stone and wood around the rims of mesas. These pueblitos helped the Navajo in two ways. First, a pueblito's location gave watchers a view to the land below. Second, the Navajo put up pueblitos in places good for cutting off attackers. Often, one pueblito could be seen from another. Navajos could then send a warning from tower to tower when enemies approached. This pueblito was built on a large boulder. Simon Canyon Ruin is the Navajo pueblito that dates back to 1754. Many Navajo raised both goats and sheep. Both animals were sources of milk, meat, and wool. For the most part, the Navajo and Spanish kept peace during the 1700s, but other Indian peoples, such as the Comanche, rode in from the Great Plains to raid the Navajo and their Apache cousins. By then, the Navajo were raiding less. Instead, they mostly farmed and hunted. They also turned to raising livestock, especially sheep. Raids for sheep, cows, and horses, however, would bring clashes with powerful new enemies. 700 U.S. soldiers and more than twice as many Mexican troops lost their lives in the Battle of Buena Vista during the Mexican-American War. The Navajos' conflict. Mexico gained its independence from Spain in 1821. For the next 25 years, Mexicans and Navajos fought one another, raiding, attacking, and taking prisoners. In 1846, Mexico went to war with the United States. In the Mexican-American War, U.S. soldiers tried to take over New Mexico, then part of Mexico, including Navajo territory. The war ended with the United States claiming land in and around Dineta. The Mexican-American War is known in Mexico as the American Invasion of Mexico. When many soldiers left the Southwest to fight in the Civil War, the Navajo mistakenly believed their efforts against the military were working. Treaties and trouble. After the United States defeated Mexico, the governor of the New Mexico Territory made a treaty with some Navajo leaders. The treaty gave the United States permission to build forts in Dineta. Traders followed the U.S. Army and set up businesses. Navajos who did not agree with the treaty raided the traders as well as white settlers' livestock. The U.S. Army failed to stop them. Then, in 1861, the soldiers went east to fight in the United States Civil War. The Navajos could then raid without fear. The final clash. As the raids worsened, New Mexico settlers formed a militia to attack the Navajo and take prisoners. General James H. Carleton ordered former explorer Kit Carson to go to Dineta to bring the Navajo to a reservation, land set aside for them to live on. Carson was joined by New Mexicans looking for revenge. From late 1863 into 1864, Carson's men destroyed Navajo crops, slaughtered their livestock, and burned their homes. By destroying crops and animals, Carson and his men left the Navajo without food for the winter. To the Navajo, Carson was known as Red Clothes because of his red underwear. Defeat and removal. In January 1864, Carson and the militia battled the Navajo at Canyon de Chelly. 23 Navajo died. More than 200 gave up. The remaining Navajo, having lost their crops and animals, faced starvation. They had no choice but to surrender. Beginning in early 1864, the U.S. Army led about 8,000 Navajo men, women, and children out of Dinatah in what became known as the Long Walk. In 1863, many Navajo tried to hide from Carson in Canyon de Chelly. There, many were starved or were shot by soldiers. Pregnant women who went into labor on the journey were killed. Only very old, young, or sick Navajo rode in wagons during the long walk. The rest were forced to walk. The Army marched the Navajo over more than 450 miles, or 725 kilometers, of land. During the 18-day march, the Navajo prisoners coped with too little firewood, no fresh water, and either bitter, cold, or blazing heat. A number of people died crossing the Rio Grande. Those unable to keep up were shot by soldiers. An unknown number, maybe hundreds, died on the way. The Big Truth, Land of Suffering. The long walk was not a single event. The Navajo were marched in groups. Some made the trip during the heat of summer and others through the snow of winter. The long walk ended at the Bosque Redondo Reservation, a place the Navajo called Wieldy, the place of suffering. Located on 40 square miles or 100 square kilometers of land. Bosque Redondo was laid out for only 5,000 people, but 8,000 were forced to live there. In 1868, after years of Navajo hardship, the Army admitted its reservation idea had failed. A new treaty allowed the Navajo to return to Dinatah. By then, however, more than 2,300 people had died. Disease. Crowding sick and exhausted people together allowed deadly diseases such as pneumonia and smallpox to spread. The Navajo had no immunity to European illnesses like smallpox, and they died in great numbers. Poor housing. Unable to build their usual houses, the Navajo had to make shelters out of sticks, canvas, and other materials. The shelters failed to protect people from heat or cold. The Navajo were also forced to build brick housing for U.S. troops. Lack of water. Desert farmers had to store water to use on crops during the hot summers. At Bosque Redondo, however, the water system failed. The broken system, combined with drought, left the Navajo unable to grow food. Caterpillars called cutworms destroyed the corn crops that managed to grow. Fort Defiance was created in an effort to control the Navajo. It eventually served as an agency for the Navajo Reservation. The Navajo Nation. The Navajo and their neighbors continued to fight after the return to Dinatah. To keep the trouble under control, the U.S. Army maintained its forts within the Navajo homeland. Other Navajo land was soon taken for other reasons. Railroads seized pieces of it to lay tracks. Miners dug up other places. Though the Navajo were promised payment for the land, they often received nothing. Fort Defiance was abandoned as a military post in the 1860s. Lack of rights. The Navajo lived on their sacred land, but they had no rights. Often outsiders attacked them or accused them of crimes they did not commit. If a Navajo was blamed for stealing horses, whites might murder him and get away with it. Soldiers hired Navajo scouts to gather information on other Navajos' plans against whites when whites and Navajos clashed. U.S. Army officers believed Navajos were most likely to trust another Navajo than a white soldier. Navajo scouts. Native American girls learned to sew at a government school. Few Navajo children attended such schools. Many Navajo parents blocked the entrance to their homes to keep officials from taking their children to school. Attacking Navajo ways. After 1868, the United States tried to erase Navajo culture. Many Navajo resisted sending their children to U.S. schools. The Navajo school children were forced to speak English and punished for using their native language. But the government plan to extinguish the Navajo language didn't work. Today, most Navajos do speak English, but almost all also speak Diné Bazad, the native Navajo language. The Navajo made some dyes for wool, thread from roots, flowers, and berries. Navajo girls learned to weave from their mothers, aunts, and grandmothers. The sheep slaughter. Between 1868 and the 1930s, the sheep population in Dinatop boomed to more than 500,000. The Navajo took advantage of this and made beautiful rugs from the wool. Sales from the rugs made them money. Because more sheep meant more wool, keeping large sheep herds helped improve their quality of life. But in the 1930s, U.S. government officials said that all those sheep harmed the land by grazing too much. The government announced it would limit the number of livestock the Navajo could have. When the Navajo refused to get rid of their sheep, government officials killed 4 out of every 5 of the animals. The slaughter all but ruined Navajo sheep ranching and rug making for a time. The Navajo suffered the additional harm beginning in 1944, when companies dumped poisonous waste from uranium mines on Navajo lands. Uranium waste causes cancer and other serious health problems. A Navajo sheep. In the 1930s, U.S. government officials shot Navajo sheep and left them to rot. Modern times. During the 20th century, the Navajo slowly bounced back and became the Navajo Nation. The nation's land expanded to about 27,000 square miles. Inside its borders today, the Navajo elect their own government, raise their own flag, and keep their own police force. They earn money from coal and oil mining, tourism, and selling arts and crafts. Today, more than 250,000 people live in the Navajo Nation. The rainbow represents the Navajo right to self-government. The Navajo flag features an outline of Navajo homelands and the tribal seal surrounded by 4 mountains. The Code Talkers. When the United States Army entered World War II, the U.S. Marines realized they needed a code language the enemy could not understand. Dine Bazad, the Navajo language, was perfect. It was a spoken rather than written language. It was also very complicated and hard to learn. In fact, it had almost no speakers outside of the Navajo Nation. Navajo Marines invented a code and later used it to send messages during important battles at Iwo Jima and elsewhere. Code talkers use Navajo words for animals to represent certain objects or ideas. For example, the code word for battleship was the Navajo term for whale. One hogan often housed not only parents and children, but also grandparents and other family members. Navajo culture. Before modern times, the traditional Navajo dwelling was a dome-shaped building called a hogan. Navajos built a hogan by covering a frame of wood with clay, stone, more wood, or other materials. They always placed the hogan's door facing east to welcome the morning sun. According to Navajo stories, the hero Coyote learned hogan building from the Beaver people. He then built a hogan for the first man and first woman. Hogans did not have windows. The hogan in everyday life. The hogan was an important part of Navajo life. The Navajo believed a lonely spirit dwelt inside. To give it attention, they sang sacred songs. Otherwise, the lonely hogan might attract evil spirits. A family could not move into a hogan until a medicine man blessed the structure. The Navajo thought of hogans as male or female. Important ceremonies took place in special 5-sided male hogans. Families lived in female hogans. The medicine man. In Navajo culture, a medicine man led sacred ceremonies. A medicine man's difficult training could take more than 20 years to complete. During his training, he mastered hundreds of rituals for as many occasions. The rituals revolved around sand painting. A medicine man used colored sand and minerals to make a sand painting's complicated design. The Navajo believed each sand painting was a being that lived in both the spirit world and our world. Timeline of Navajo history. 1539, the Spanish arrive in the Southwest. 1864, the Navajo are forced on the long walk to Bosque Redondo. 1868, the Navajo return to Dinatah. 1930s, Navajo sheep are slaughtered by the U.S. government. A medicine man might use a sand painting to heal others. For example, he chanted as his sick patient sat on the sand painting. The Navajo believed that spirits then came into the world through the sand painting and took away the illness. The sand painting then had to be destroyed. For that reason, a sand painting, no matter how beautiful, remained in place for no more than a day. Later on, the Navajo forbade anyone to photograph a sand painting to protect its sacred power. The dried blossoms of certain flowers, such as larkspur, delphinium, were used to create shades of blue for sand paintings. Arts and crafts. Navajo culture also valued the creation of a permanent artwork. That remains true today. Like the Pueblo peoples, the Navajo made kachina dolls. Unlike the Pueblo peoples, however, Navajo kachinas have no religious purpose. They are simply a craft. In addition, the Navajo are world famous for weaving wool into rugs. While the Navajo may weave for art or money, they also consider weaving an opportunity to get together with friends and family. The most valuable kachinas are made from a single piece of root from the cottonwood tree. Navajo tradition holds that the spirit spider woman first taught the Navajo to weave. Some rugs have geometric shapes, others include figures of people or animals from stories or everyday life. The simple rug patterns reflect the Navajo view that the world is balanced and organized. In fact, Navajo tradition says the world itself is woven together. Navajo patterns appeal to non-Navajo too. Navajo rugs hang in museums and earn money for today's weavers. Modern Navajo jewelry makers work silver into earrings, hairpins, bracelets, and buckles for use by Navajos and non-Navajos alike. Art, like history and religious belief, weaves together the Navajos' past and present. True statistics. Time the Dene first traded with Pueblo peoples, 1200s. Time needed to study to become a medicine man, more than 20 years. Time it took to make the long walk, 18 days. Number of people who made the long walk, about 8,000. Number of sheep owned by Navajo in 1930, more than 500,000. Percentage of Navajo-owned sheep lost between 1934 and 1952 because of government slaughter, 80. Number of Navajo code talkers during World War II, 29. Area of Navajo Nation today, 27,000 square miles, or 70,000 square kilometers. Population of the Navajo Nation today, 250,000. Did you find the truth? It is true that in the 1930s, the U.S. government killed more than 4/5 of the livestock on Navajo lands. It is false that kachina dolls are sacred objects to the Navajo. Important words. Athabascan, the family of Native American language that includes Navajo. Drought, a long period of unusually low rainfall. Independence, a state of not being controlled by others. Kachina, a wooden doll that represents a god or a spirit of an ancestor. Mesas, broad, flat-topped hills with steep sides. Migrated, moved from one place to another. Militia, people called up in an emergency to act as soldiers. Pueblitos, small towers made of stone or wood built by the Navajo. Rituals, religious ceremonies with specific rules. Sacred, related to religion or something holy. Traditional, established patterns of thought or action passed down from generation to generation. Treaty, an agreement or deal that is legally binding on the two or more groups who sign. Uranium, a metal used in nuclear weapons. The Navajo. What was the Long Walk? It was a difficult journey the U.S. government forced thousands of Navajo to make from their lands. Inside you'll find information about a secret code based on the Navajo language used during World War II, maps, a timeline, photos of Navajo dolls, rugs, and jewelry, surprising true facts that will shock and amaze you. The Navajo.